On behalf of the Board of Trustees, I'd like to welcome all of y'all here tonight to our program. This synagogue was founded in 1886, and over the course of our history, can you all hear me? Good. Over the course of our history, we've hosted many important programs and many important leaders in our community. And over the past 36 years, we've been very fortunate to have the Fran Eizenstat and Eizenstat Family Memorial Lecture. I can remember as a lifelong member of this synagogue coming to one of the very first speakers, Natan Sharansky, over 35 years ago. And in fact, I was looking through the program tonight where we've listed all of the featured speakers over the past 36 years, and I realized that I've been a part of almost 80% of the lectures. I feel like I've had a front row seat to learn from those who have made and changed our world and the country that we live in. And I'm very excited tonight that we will have General David Petraeus speak as well. And I look forward to that conversation. But before we begin, I have some thank yous that I'd like to make. First, I would like to thank Wayne Kyle, our executive director, and Lauren Dykman, Damone Fanuni, and Chris Carr, whose tireless efforts made tonight possible. I would also like to thank Miriam Strickman-Levitas, Gail Solomon, and Gary Olimpic for helping us with the process. I would also like to acknowledge that we have a few dignitaries in the congregation today. Our Georgia State Representative Esther Panich and our Sandy Springs Councilman Andy Bauman. I would also like to take this opportunity to extend a very warm thank you to Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat for the gift that he has given our synagogue over the past 36 years. Thank you. And I would also like to extend a warm welcome to General David Petraeus. Welcome to our community. Welcome to our synagogue. Shalom. And now I would like to introduce our head rabbi, Laurence Rosenthal, to say a few words of reflection.
Thank you. So welcome, everybody. Like our president, Mark Stern, I want to thank a few people, again, to Wayne, Kyle, and our entire staff, listing specifically Lauren Dykman and Damone Fanuni for the tireless efforts they put, but the entire staff did an incredible job, so thank you, Wayne. I want to thank Chris Carr and the maintenance staff for making this place beautiful and making it accessible to all of us. So thank you to Chris. When you see any of them, please say hello, and thank you. Officer Joe Jones and our security staff. It is tough. When you have a general coming to the synagogue, you take no chances, and they have taken none. So we are well protected, and it's because of Officer Jones and his incredible security team. So thank you to them. Also to our leadership, to Mark Stern and the rest of the officers and board members and trustees for making this congregation work the way it does. Of course, Ambassador Eizenstat, I'm grateful to you for everything you bring and the dedication you bring through this memorial lecture, so thank you to you. And a very, very special thank you to Marilyn Ginsburg Eckstein, who's right here, for the incredible gift she's given by our cultural arts series of our community, not just to help bring this lecture, but also thank you, but not only, thank you for reminding me, not only bringing this lecture, but also all the incredible music that I know many of us have participated in listening and so much of the other stuff. So thank you to Marilyn and the gift that you give. If this is meaningful to you, I really want to invite all of you to think about making a gift to the synagogue in some way or another to help continue it. This stuff doesn't happen for free. So you could go to the AA synagogue and do what is meaningful to you. It'll be meaningful to us. The other plug I'd like to make is that if you're also in need of a spiritual community, a spiritual family, we hope you will think about Ahavat Achim as your spiritual home. There are a lot of people that I see here, a lot of members of our congregation, but there's a lot of people I am seeing for the first time, or maybe I don't see much at all. I know those might be my members as well, but that's okay. I won't call you out. But your voice is amplified You are made stronger, and our community made stronger by your participation. Judaism does not believe in an individual redemption. It believes in a communal redemption. And so the only way that we are able to make the world better is as we. So I hope that you will think about becoming. If you don't have a spiritual community of your own, you'll call the office tomorrow, talk to our very own Lauren Dykeman, who you've been hearing about, and think about what this community could offer to you and what you could offer to this community. So I want to share with you something that's really meaningful to me. It's called synchronicity. In the observant world, synchronicity is the word we use instead of coincidence. When two things line up, many of us say coincidence, but in truth, it is synchronicity. Those things are coming together to point something out. Now we have General David Petraeus here to speak to us about the entire global affairs that are going on, about what it looks like on the ground and from higher up, about the affairs that affect us most. And of course, we're so interested in all these military issues that are going on all over the world, especially places that are all precious to us. And how amazing it is that we're reading in this week's Parshat Vayishlach all about a military engagement between brothers. Jacob and Esau, after many, many years of not seeing each other, now Jacob is going to have to confront the brother who swore to his destruction. And as he gets ready for this encounter, he sends reconnaissance. He sends people to go scout it out. They come back with a report that worries him even more. He sends gifts hoping to placate Esau. It doesn't seem to slow down the battalion that Esau is bringing with him. He separates his camp as a good military move in order to make sure that if one group gets destroyed, the other will remain. And of course, he takes the time, like any good leader does, to be alone, to think it through, and to make sure he's covered everything. And it's in that night that he struggles. He has his own personal struggle. The most amazing part of the story is that throughout it all, and when we get to the end, it turns out we were wrong the whole time. Jacob had all of it wrong. And we only find that in the moment that he and Esau come head to head. Now, I won't spoil it for any of you who haven't read it. You can come this Saturday to your new synagogue that you're joining tomorrow and hear all about what happens when they come face to face. But in truth, that is the way that any of this gets resolved, isn't it? Now, I know we have a lot of armchair generals here. I know you watch the news, and if you have been paying attention to any of my sermons over the last 10 years, you will know that I'm not a big fan of all of us watching incessantly the news and thinking we are experts of anything. Because all that does is get us more and more distance. But here, with Ambassador Eizenstat and General Petraeus, you can't get closer to the facts. You can't get closer to the ground. You cannot get closer to the truth than this. So I know as they are speaking tonight, you will think to yourself, well, I know differently. And I'm sure General Petraeus would love to hear your thoughts and opinions on what should and could have been done. But I hope you'll listen deeply. Because what Jacob and Esau tells us is that the only true answer is one of proximity. The farther and farther you are away of any situation, and let me tell you, my friends, our couches and our lazy boy chairs are as far as it could possibly be from those conflicts. The farther you are, the less truth you have. But the closer you are, the more surprised you'll be at what reality looks like and what opportunities we have to truly find peace and wholeness in this world. So General Petraeus and Ambassador Eizenstat, I'm grateful you're both here, and I'm looking forward to your incredible presentation that will begin very soon. I invite Ambassador Eizenstat to share a few words of introduction, and then, of course, invite our speaker to the dais.
Welcome to the 36th Annual Fran Eizenstat and Eizenstat Family Memorial Lecture. Special thanks to President Mark Stern, Executive Director Wayne Kyle, and Lorence Dickman, who I've been in constant contact with, the chair of the evening, Miriam Levitas, and of course, Rabbi Rosenthal, for all the hard work that made this possible, and for the generosity of Marilyn Ginsburg Eckstein and her fund. I created this fund and this series in 1987 to honor my late father and my late mother, Leo and Sylvia Eizenstat, and then my Uncle Barry and Aunt Bessie, and most recently my wonderful wife of 45 years, Fran. Fran was a genuine Eshet Chayil, which is the basis for a poem from Proverbs signifying a woman of valor whose virtues include wisdom, strength, accomplishment. Fran had all of these and more. She was beautiful inside and out, lighting up every room she entered and making lasting friendships all over the world. She was remarkably accomplished, graduating from Brandeis University, spending a junior semester in Israel, and having 2 master's degrees, while at the same time raising a family with 2 great boys, Jay and Brian, and I'm proud to say that Brian is here tonight from New York. She put her academic achievements to fruitful use, helping the disadvantaged in our society. She was a leader in both the secular and Jewish communities. She was an instrumental person in the election of Andrew Young as the first Black congressman from the Deep South since Reconstruction. She was chosen for the prestigious Atlanta Leadership Program, and in the Jewish world was a leader in local, national, and international organizations. Fran and my family would have been especially proud of our guest tonight. Over 4 decades, we've brought distinguished speakers to this congregation in politics, in diplomacy, in art, in journalism, and academia, from the US, from Europe, and from Israel. This has included 4 Nobel Peace Prize winners, 4 Pulitzer Prize winners, 2 US presidents, 2 Israeli prime ministers and 1 Israeli president, 2 Supreme Court justices, among others. But tonight's is really different from all others. And we're particularly honored to have one of the greatest and most respected military leaders of our time, 4-star General David Petraeus, as our guest. In his 37-year career in the military, he has held 6 consecutive commands as general officer, 5 in combat, including the surge in Iraq, in which he literally turned around the Iraq War in our favor. He headed the Central Command, which is responsible for 21 countries in the Middle East, including Israel. He also led all Allied forces in Afghanistan. He's widely known as literally the world's greatest expert on combating terrorism and counterinsurgency activities. And he inspired the Army's new manual on counterinsurgency warfare. His new book, Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Gaza, has been widely praised and is a New York Times bestseller. And for those of you who are interested in buying the book, we'll have a sign-up sheet outside, and the general will send you autographed book plates that you can put in it. As great as his military accomplishments have been, he has an incredible breadth of experience and knowledge. He served as the 4th director of the CIA. He's the only person in Army history to be the top graduate of both the demanding Army Ranger School and the Army's Command and General Staff College. In addition to being a West Point graduate, he found time to earn a PhD from Princeton in International Relations and Economics. And he has taught at the U.S. Military Academy, the City University of New York, the University of Southern California, and at Harvard. He's currently a partner at KKR, a major worldwide investment firm, and chairs their Global Institute. General Petraeus, your service to our country and to a better world is an inspiration to all of us. You've drawn this enormous crowd because of that. So let's get down to business and start talking about the world.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador. It is great to be back on a stage with you. We've done this act before. It is a huge privilege to deliver the memorial conversation, really, lecture that is in your family's name. And I guess we have someone expressing his First Amendment rights here, or is this? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being here.
It's a privilege to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for being here as well.
Okay. Please, we have a program. Thank you.
But again, it's a particular honor, not that I'm in the least bit competitive, Stuart, but I noticed that I'm the first general. And liking firsts during my career, I feel particularly delighted to do that. But really, it's beyond a pleasure to be on stage with you, to do it in the synagogue that was and still is yours, and in a memorial lecture that bears the name of your parents and your wife.
Well, thank you so much, General. We're now living through major wars between Israel and Hamas in Gaza with a fragile ceasefire, and between Russia and Ukraine. In our lifetime, our country has been involved in wars in Vietnam, 2 in the Balkans and Bosnia and Kosovo, twice in Iraq with the 2 Bushes, Bush 1 and Bush 2. Our longest war in American history, 20 years in Afghanistan and in Libya, with mixed results. Based upon your unparalleled experience, explain to us the lessons that a military commander must have to either succeed or, if he doesn't have it, to fail. And what mistake or combination of mistakes have sometimes led many of these military interventions to come out differently than we had hoped?
Well, the way to answer that, I think, is to let me describe and then discuss the intellectual construct for strategic leadership, because you're talking about the leader at the very top of a theater of war, Iraq, Afghanistan, that I was privileged to do, others of these over the years, Vietnam, various theaters of World War II, and so forth. So you kindly mentioned I had these 5 combat commands. There was one that was not at combat. It was between my 3- and 4-star tours in Iraq. And it turned out that this was the engine of change for our Army. You controlled all kinds. I had 6 different titles, believe it or not. If you kept your hat spinning fast enough and were aggressive enough, there was nothing you couldn't do in our Army. Among the tasks we laid out was that, believe it or not, 3 or more years into 2 counterinsurgency campaigns, we did not have a counterinsurgency field manual. So we had no common intellectual foundation. We developed that. We did it. There's never been a manual produced in less than a year before. We did that. I was the editor-in-chief and drove that together with Jim Mattis. We did it for our ground forces, Army and Marines. But at the same time that year, in addition to overhauling all kinds of other aspects of how we prepared our forces, our leaders, our staffs, our units, our equipment, our organizational structures, et cetera, to deploy to Iraq and Afghanistan, I developed a construct for myself, because while I'd had some very significant positions before, some with enormous latitude, I'd never been the overall commander of a theater of war, so the strategic leader. And there is a model that I developed for strategic leadership that I developed and shared it only with my inner circle, so they understood what I was trying to do. And the first and foremost task of a strategic leader is to get the big ideas right, to craft the right strategy. By the way, same in business, whether you're a founder of a startup or the CEO of a major corporation, you've got to get the big ideas right up front. Sounds easy. We have failed to do it, and I'll lay out a number of cases in which that was the situation. You have to understand every aspect of that theater, the physical terrain, the human terrain, how the country's supposed to work, how it really works, all the ethnic, sectarian, tribal, political, all these different dynamics, the neighborhood and all the rest of that, and craft the right strategy. Second, you have to communicate the big ideas effectively. through the breadth and depth of your organization, so that the soldier on the ground, the strategic sergeant, as we call them, going outside the wire, doing only what those in uniform could do, which is engage the enemy and the population, understands what I'm trying to get across at my level and translate it into concrete action at that level at which they're performing. You have to communicate that broadly, but also to everyone who has a stake in the outcome of the endeavor. That includes America's mothers and fathers. That's why it was so accessible to the press. It includes, obviously, the White House, the Pentagon, number 10 Downing Street, the capitals of all of our coalition countries, obviously the Iraqi White House, our Iraqi counterparts, the Iraqi people. All of this, you've got to communicate that to them. And then you have to perform a third task, which is overseeing the execution of the big ideas. This is what we normally think of as leadership. This is the energy the leader provides, the example, the inspiration. It's hiring the best and brightest, hanging on to them as long as you can, incentivizing them, developing them. It's allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's the organizational architecture that you design to carry out this campaign. No two are alike. It's the metrics that you use, and they have to be honest. They have to be appropriate for what you're trying to achieve. The body count measure in Vietnam was both questioned in integrity terms over time and also the wrong metric for that war. I'll explain that in a moment. And then you have to determine how you spend your time, your own battle rhythm, your recurring meetings, events, activities. These are crucial. We spent a lot of time determining how I could most efficiently, effectively, and productively use my time. And we captured it all on a huge butcher block piece of paper that had in great detail what we did every single day of the week, bar none, 7-day-a-week endeavor, what we did several times a week, which included going out right after all the morning updates and so forth in small groups, immediately to a small unit, go on patrol with them to experience a little bit of what it is they're going through, and so forth and so on. What you do weekly, every other week, monthly, all the way up to the quarterly 6-hour ambassador and commander hosted review of the campaign plan and how we were doing. So that's crucial as well. And on that battle rhythm, you have events, activities, and meetings that enable you to perform the fourth task, or sometimes force you, because you need to be forced. You need action forcing mechanisms to make you sit down and determine how you need to refine the big ideas as the situation evolves, as you achieve progress or experience setbacks, so that you can do it again and again and again. Now, this sounds pretty straightforward. We invest a huge amount in the individual who ends up being at the top of a theater of war. You know, they've had a commissioning, they've had basic officer course, advanced course as a captain, staff college as a major, war college as a colonel. 2 of these are academic year-long further investments in these leaders. You even have courses after you're promoted to flag rank to general officer. And yet we have failed to do that on a number of occasions. Both the French and the Americans in Vietnam failed to get the big ideas. The French never got them right. It took us 13 years to get them right. We thrashed around in the jungle trying to win a war of attrition against the North and their insurgents in the South, and it was not doable. We brought in big units and chased them all over the highlands and the rice paddies and the triple canopy jungle, trying to find an elusive enemy and then kill as many of them as we could. We might kill 10 of them for every one of us. It was never enough. And by the way, in that terrific book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, Lieutenant General retired Hal Moore, who fought and won the first really big battle of the war, the Ai Drang Valley, when we brought in our helicopters and so forth. I always had read that before. When it came out, I was commanding an air assault infantry battalion in the 101st Airborne Division, which is what he was commanding at the time, albeit from the 1st Cavalry Division. And I never read the reflections in the end. I read it for all the battle scenes and all of that stuff, and it was just electric. It was very, very vivid. But this time, when I was doing this book, and I did the chapter on Vietnam, that was the subject of my PhD dissertation, also the chapters of Iraq and Afghanistan in the first person, because it didn't work right otherwise. This time I looked at the reflections in the back, and he wrote in there, you know, I think General Westmoreland was really pleased that we killed 10 of them for every one of us, but I'm not sure America's mothers and fathers agreed with that assessment, and he was absolutely right. 13 years we went before we realized that we could not win the war that we were trying to fight, and finally got the big ideas right. But it was after the Tet Offensive in late 1968. We'd lost credibility in the home front, we'd lost the population, and it was going to be Henry Kissinger's job to figure out how to extricate ourselves from a war that was not sustainable. And sustainability is measured in the expenditure of your blood and your treasure, as I'll talk about with Vietnam or with Afghanistan, which was sustainable. So again, we have a number of cases in which we literally have not gotten the big ideas right. When you look at Iraq, pretty good big ideas for the fight to Baghdad. I was a two-star then commanding the great 101st Airborne Division, toppled that regime much more rapidly than people thought. Real problems, though, with what followed. We clearly had not thought through remotely well enough for the phase 4, the post-conflict phase. Witness that Secretary Rumsfeld fired the first crowd that he'd actually brought together to oversee that process. I remember asking them, by the way, before we launched the invasion, they brought us together for one final session, and the commander said, anybody got any questions? And again, I was just a two-star, but so I said, excuse me, can you give us a little more detail about what happens after we get to Baghdad and topple the regime? And one of the retired three-stars, who was the co-head of the Organization for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, so he knew me, he said, Dave, look, you just get us to Baghdad, we'll take it from there. Obviously, that didn't exactly work out real well. They replaced him with a coalition provisional authority. Big mistake. You should have put an embassy on the ground right away with existing funding, expertise, and all the rest of that, going back to the mothership at State Department, bringing the Corps of Engineers, not a pickup team of engineers and construction and contractors, bringing the Army contracting or defense contracting. You could have put it all together right away. Instead, we bring in this body that was rotating on a 3-month basis. We had no continuity whatsoever. And what were the first two big ideas announced by the new Coalition Provisional Authority head? Let's fire the entire Iraqi military without telling them what their future is and how we are going to enable them to provide for themselves and their families. And then let's compound that by firing the entire Ba'ath Party, Saddam's party to be sure, in the top 2 or 3 levels needed not just to be fired, but to be captured or killed. We killed Saddam's 2 sons when they resisted detention. But when you got to level 4, this is tens and tens of thousands of bureaucrats that we needed to run a country that we did not sufficiently understand. Big, big, bad ideas, huge mistakes that set us back for years. We never got a reconciliation process, which is what should have been announced at the same time that you announced de-Baathification, until years later. In fact, I got a special exception. I got Ambassador Bremer, the head of the CPA, on a helicopter on a really hot July day, had the doors open deliberately, so it's like you're inside a dryer. And I saw he was nodding a little bit, and I said, hey, Ambassador, we have a little test case up here in Mosul with reconciliation, because all these people are thrown out of their jobs. They have nothing else to do. Their incentive is to oppose the new Iraq rather than to support it. And okay, and so we reconciled with 30,000 people, and it went really, really well that whole period of time. We then sort of got things back on track after this. We brought in an embassy after about 1.5 years. Again, should have done that right up front. Had a pretty good strategy, and then it was invalidated by violence in early 2006 when Sunni extremists, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, blew up a Shia mosque, 3rd holiest in the entire country, and set off a cycle of Sunni-Shia civil war, essentially, by the end of that particular year. And it took us far too long to recognize that our strategy had been invalidated. And that clear an area and hand off to Iraqis could no longer work. That was basically clear and leave, because they could no longer secure the areas because the level of violence had dramatically exceeded their capacity. That's when we started the surge. I have often noted that the surge that mattered most was not the extra nearly 30,000 forces, which helped us enormously to expedite, to accelerate the implementation of the new big ideas. The surge of ideas was what was mattered, and that was the new big idea that we're going to clear, hold, and build and transition.
So I think it's important that you
leave.
use 3 words to turn a disastrous situation around, so that today Iraq is actually a functioning democracy.
So we drove violence down by 90%,
Right.
and it kept going down further the next 3.5 years. Then the prime minister, the minute our final combat forces left, we shouldn't have pulled them all out, by the way. I opposed that. But the minute that happened, he took ruinous sectarian actions against the Sunnis. You had this whole episode. The Islamic State comes back eventually, but now it actually has, I was just in Baghdad for the first time since being CIA director. It looked amazing. Yes, there's all kinds of worries about Iranian influence and the Shia militia that have their own political parties, but they just had a relatively free and fair election, and they will have another
But you might just
determination of a
explain
government.
briefly, you had three big ideas which turned around a disastrous situation, and we'll talk in a minute about how that might apply to Gaza.
Very much
One
applies
was,
to Gaza.
one was clear, one was hold, and one was build.
And then gradually transition.
And you might just mention what
Sure.
you meant by each of those, and
Yep.
particularly the hold.
Yep. So again, the
build.
violence was out of control in Baghdad and many other areas of Iraq because of this Sunni-Shia civil war, or because of Al-Qaeda and Sunni insurgents in predominantly Sunni areas. All a struggle for power and, frankly, resources. And what we had to do was drive this violence down. By the way, we had metrics for this. The most important metric of all was Iraqi civilian casualties, not our casualties. So I drafted a set of counterinsurgency guidance. It was all admonitions, and I published it myself, and I'd redo it every 8 weeks or whatever, go out to everybody. It was a series of admonitions, as I said. The first was secure and serve the people. We can only do this by living with them. We're going back downtown. We're no longer going to go through an area, kill a bunch of bad guys, and then pull out, after which, predictably, they're going to rebuild the bad guys. They may not be as well trained, well equipped, et cetera. So you have to clear and hold. You have to live with the people. And you use what are called population control measures, or as we termed them in Baghdad, gated communities. I used to point out to the Iraqi people that you spend a lot of money to have a gated community in Florida. We're giving it to you for free. Actually, it just is big walls. Walls work in these kind of areas. Very tall T-walls, they were called, Texas barriers. By the way, you had to wire them together, or they'll use earth-moving equipment to get through. This was serious stuff. And you have one way in and one way out. It's called an entry control point. Keep in mind that another metric was driving down the number of suicide car bombs and suicide vest attacks. And again, you have a comprehensive approach to this, including going after those in Syria who are ferrying these people in and attracting them and all the rest of that. But that entry control point is elaborate. It's a big chicane. It has bars at either end because you've got to keep the potential car bombs and people with vests on at an arm's length until you can validate that they don't have that. So you'll use X-ray machines, bomb-sniffing dogs, other thermal devices, et cetera. So this is quite complex, but it's pretty straightforward. And you just replicate this again and again and again.
I think one thing that impressed me, and again we'll go to Gaza in a minute, is the word build, which was the third part, clear, hold, and build.
Yes, yep.
And you told me that in your office during the war, you had a sign that said, "How many Iraqis have we helped today?" And that your goal was to try to convince the non-combatant Iraqis that they were better off not joining the terrorists, that they'd get a better way of life by working with us, and that meant build the country up, give them jobs and things. So you might talk about that, because I think, again, it's an issue we'll get to with Gaza.
So first, once you establish security, if you have cleared a neighborhood, you've gone through every building, floor, room, cellar. We didn't have tunnels. That's a huge difference with Gaza. It makes it vastly more difficult. But you cleared everything, and you do it progressively so they can't get behind you and stay. Again, these are reasonable sized neighborhoods, could be thousands of people. And you've sealed it all off with walls, and you have an entry control point. Then the people who are allowed to be in there, who belong there, get biometric ID cards, which they show each time, and these work, by the way. And again, that you go through the chicane and all that, and you just keep building these all around. You keep expanding what's called the oil spot. But the way you solidify security gains, that foundation, without which nothing else is possible, is by what you do to convince the people that their life is better off if they support you than if they support the bad guys, whoever it is. Shia militia supported by Iran, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Sunni insurgents, whatever. And that's because, again, all of a sudden they see the basic services. It might start with humanitarian assistance, then restore basic services, then rebuild all the damaged infrastructure, schools, clinics, roads, bridges. By the way, Al-Qaeda, when I took over the surge, had knocked down virtually every bridge in the entire Baghdad up to the north. So one of the metrics was, I had a bridge report once a week, showed how we're doing repairing all the bridges. We had the same thing for pipelines, for high tension wires and all the rest of that. The people start seeing, you know what? They're securing us, number one, and then our life is getting much, much better. And then we want to transition that support, not just for us, but to the Iraqi government, the Iraqi forces, and so forth. We had to reconstitute all the Iraqi units that had all been rendered combat ineffective by the levels of violence. Keep in mind that in Baghdad, when the surge began, there were 53 dead civilian bodies due to violence every 24 hours. This is a capital that is out of control. And again, we had the metrics for all of this. So as this just keeps expanding, and by the way, we went in right on the ethnic and sectarian fault lines, oftentimes, because you have to stop it right there. As this progresses, the overall level of violence starts going down. First, it was civilian losses goes down, then sensational attacks, car bombs and vest bombs, and so forth. Then it's incidents. We had a measure for that. And then all of this was very, very granular and ratcheted down. I brought a Rhodes Scholar out of the Air Force Academy, lieutenant colonel with a PhD in data analytics and so forth, to nail down the definitions, the sources of the information, the deconfliction, et cetera, because I was going to lay it out to Congress, and did at the 6-month mark. And then we're going to live and die in terms of how we're doing on this based on those metrics. And so it just keeps progressing. We bring the Iraqi units back. We gradually thin out as they begin to take over. We always keep control of the entry control point. That's a point of critical, that can't fail. But over time, you just start to thin out and you can focus your efforts elsewhere.
So, again, before we get to Gaza, one other question. Our longest war in American history, 20 years, was in Afghanistan.
Yes.
And here we are in 2025 with a Taliban government, which we fought for 20 years to avoid. So why did what you laid out so brilliantly in Iraq not work in Afghanistan?
A number of reasons. First, we didn't even get the big ideas right in Afghanistan for the first 8 years. We had the wrong strategy. General McChrystal fixed that. I was his boss by that time at Central Command. We'd already had 3 or more years in combat together. Second, we didn't get the inputs right. In other words, almost the right level of forces, diplomats, spies, development experts, et cetera, right for another year. And then we only kept it right for about 8 months before we began drawing down. And we drew down in accordance with a pledge made during the speech in which we announced the buildup at West Point. At the same time, we said we're going to start drawing down on this date, which I strongly disagreed with, because it's telling the enemy in a contest of wills that you want to go home, which we did repeatedly, and that undermined the cause. Beyond that, Afghanistan was much more challenging. I laid this out for Secretary Rumsfeld. On my way home from my 3-star tour in Iraq, he asked me to go to Afghanistan. He did this to me several times to come back and do assessments. I took a team over there, and I came back, and the first slide was titled, "Afghanistan Does Not Equal Iraq," and it compared and contrasted by a number of different factors, Iraq and Afghanistan. And frankly, Afghanistan was much, much more challenging, even though at that time, the level of violence was 1/10 that of Iraq. And at the bottom it said, Afghanistan is going to be the longest of the long war. So it was a more difficult, it's much more rural. It was much more vast in terms. You have the Hindu Kush, so the terrain really does matter. It had most significantly sanctuaries for the enemy in Pakistan, to whom we were giving, of course, something like 1/3 of their entire defense budget through $3.5 billion.
So the Taliban, when things got rough, could go over the border
Yes.
to Pakistan,
Yes.
and we couldn't go after them
That's
because
right.
that was our ally.
That's right. They were in the south in Kandahar. I pointed out many times to the Chief of Army Staff, the most powerful man in Pakistan, that there's a reason why the leadership of the Taliban is called the Quetta Shura. The Quetta is the capital of Baluchistan province of Pakistan. It's because that's where they are. And we can tell you where they are, and we'd love if you just let us go after them. The other was the Haqqani network, which was up in North Waziristan. These two are the leadership now, and there's some friction between them, but they're the leaders of Afghanistan at this point. And they were in North Waziristan, the heart of darkness, and the Pakistanis wouldn't go after them themselves, and they limited very dramatically what it was that we were able to do to them. We could go after Al-Qaeda and some others, but it was much more restrictive. So they could just scamper back. They could outlast you. And then the last issue is, frankly, the drawdown pace, which should be determined on basis of conditions, objective conditions on the battlefield against actual measures that you employ to determine when it's right to transfer security and so forth to the Afghans, the host nation in a district, a province, and so on. That started being determined much more by conditions in Washington than it was conditions on the battlefield. The truth is that we didn't have to leave, Stu. There was no compelling reason other than the shibboleth that you have to end endless wars. You don't have to end endless wars unless they're not sustainable. Vietnam was not sustainable. Afghanistan was very sustainable. Again, the measures, blood and treasure. We hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months, not because of that diplomatic agreement that the previous administration made with the Taliban, which was just extraordinary. We gave them what they wanted, which was us leaving. And to convince them to let us to leave, we agreed to force the Afghan government to release 5,500 Taliban detainees, which included many senior leaders who immediately went back and enabled the ultimate simultaneous offensives that then cracked the Afghan security forces. Again, we hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months in combat because we weren't on the front lines. We were doing what's called advise, assist, and enable operations, not on the front, with the exception of some counterterrorism missions periodically. And the cost was $25 billion out of an $800 to $850 billion defense budget. And we should have seen what was coming. I said publicly that we will come to regret this, and I sure hope we have, because we've consigned a people we spent 20 years trying to improve their lives imperfectly, and they were imperfect and we were imperfect, and a lot of mistakes made along the way. But surely their lives are far, far better in that period that we were there than they are right now, where 50% of the population can't even go to high school, much less to college.
The women.
And can't leave the home without a male guardian. It's half the population is also starving. Obviously, the economy has collapsed and all the rest of that. So we really didn't have to leave, and obviously the way we left was beyond chaotic.
For sure. So Gaza is an area where I think everyone in this audience is intensely interested. It actually is Israel's longest war. And we have a situation now in which, as soon as the Phase 1 agreement, which I think President Trump deserves a lot of credit for carving out in his 20-point plan, the first phase is there, a ceasefire, hostages for prisoners exchange. But now we have a situation, General, where 47% of Gaza is still held by Hamas, 53% by Israel.
And the people are all in the 47% controlled by Hamas.
People are all in the 47%.
Yep.
And you said in your long career in the Army, you had never seen a more complex urban battlefield.
Correct.
You might explain that and explain, will we ever get to Phase 2? And let me just explain this. Under Phase 2 of President Trump's plan, which again is an excellent plan, it means you go from a ceasefire to actual peace. And the way you do that under his plan is you disarm Hamas, you put in an international stabilization force, and you put in a non-Hamas government. Now the fact is, who's going to disarm
That is
Hamas?
the big question.
So tell us about where we are now with Gaza, and what does Israel have to do? What does the United States have to do? What
Sure.
do the Arab countries have to do? Is this going to end up being Israel's Vietnam?
Depends if they get the big ideas right. So let me talk first, actually, to be fair, about what Israel did to Lebanese Hezbollah, which is just sheer genius. The episode in that which started Hezbollah down the road to enormous degradation is the greatest intelligence supply chain operation in history, greater than the Trojan horse because of the scale, the magnitude of. We did a lot of supply chain when I was CI director and military commander, but they were discrete. This was on a scale that was just never been seen. Thousands of pagers, which of course Israel Mossad bought from reportedly a Taiwanese manufacturer, made a few adjustments to them en route, delivered them to Hezbollah directly, believe it or not, which had been persuaded to get off their cell phones because if they didn't, they're going to get geolocated. Thousands blow up simultaneously. By the way, what triggered it was an encrypted message, which on that pager required both thumbs to decrypt. So think about where it is when it blows up. So it didn't kill more than a few dozen, but it seriously wounded virtually the entire senior leadership. And we're talking thousands. So not just decapitating, they'd already accounted for about 18 of the top 20 at that point. Now we're talking thousands that have been taken out of action. Then the next day, don't forget, the walkie-talkies blew up, and that was their last means of communication for command and control and communications. So now Israel has denied Hezbollah the ability to do what we all feared most, and that is to use the 150,000 at the start of the war, 150,000 missiles, drones, rockets that could reach Israel, many of them simultaneously in a way that would overwhelm even the extraordinarily sophisticated counter-drone, counter-air, and ballistic missile defenses of Israel. And that was prevented from happening because they couldn't plan it now, they couldn't rehearse it, they couldn't communicate about it. It rendered their entire C3 ISR, command, control, communications, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, incapable of conducting its mission. And then they could just hammer Hezbollah brilliantly using the intelligence that they'd been gathering up all the way since the war in 2006, and again, dramatically degraded. Hezbollah did limited operations on the ground, also some into Syria, but a masterful campaign. And they will continue to go after them. I should have started, in fact, by saying we should recognize that Israel has made a fundamental shift in their national security approach. They will never again allow a force to build up not just on their borders, but in the region, again, the way that they have. And if they see it happening, as they are, where Lebanese armed forces are unable to disarm Hezbollah the way we are rightly insisting and the Israelis are insisting, they'll just continue to keep them degraded so that they can't ever pose the kind of threat that they posed before. Iran, 12-day operation, magnificent, extraordinary, really. We didn't know how the F-35 was going to perform against the sophisticated Russian-provided S-300 early warning ballistic missile defense system. They took it all out. They basically rendered Iran defenseless against air operations as long as you stayed above the range of a heavy machine gun. That's basically all that was left. And they took down many, many dozens of other air defense batteries as well, and then just tore apart the nuclear program, set it back years. Yes, there could be some highly enriched uranium hidden somewhere, maybe some advanced centrifuges. That'll be found out, and if and when the US and or Israel find it out, Israel will take it out because they're not going to let them enrich again. So again, and they also took out dozens of nuclear scientists with the sophisticated Mossad drone operations on the ground from inside Iran itself, and then the US piled on in the final day to add what only we have, the massive ordnance penetrator 30,000-pound bomb with many 6 or some odd thousands of pounds of explosive that penetrate down and then blow up, and you just pile drive it down inside the deeply buried site at Fordo, and you take out, make sure you double tap all the other sites that are significant. And again, I think if Israel sees Iran reassembling certain threatening capabilities, particularly the missiles, they'll go after them again. Certainly if they try to enrich, they will as well. So masterful campaigns. And then those enabled something that very few people thought was possible, and that was the toppling of the murderous Bashar al-Assad regime, an Iranian ally, which had allowed Iran to transit, so they'd go across Iraq, through Syria, and then down into southern Lebanon to reconstitute Hezbollah, to build them up and so forth. That is no longer an option. because Ahmed al-Shara, who was in detention in Iraq during the entire time I was the commander there, he was an al-Qaeda cell leader, spent 5 years in our care and feeding, then led, yes, an al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, then broke away from that, built a sort of basically political Islam up in Idlib province. He built a force that was really capable, took them out first up in the second largest city in the north. Then he sees that Hama and Homs are open, the road to Damascus is open, and he takes it, and Bashar al-Assad and his wife fly to Moscow. And that very important ally for Iran is no longer there for them. And this came about because Hezbollah couldn't come to the rescue the way they had before. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, Quds Force, couldn't come to the rescue, nor could Russian air power. They're obviously preoccupied in Ukraine. So the three elements that kept Bashar al-Assad on the throne throughout the Sunni Shia civil war there were no longer able to help him out, and he had to take off. So again, extraordinary. Gaza. I have said, and Stu knows this because we've had this conversation before, that the right big ideas for Gaza should be clear, hold, build, transition. And to do it, I'll just lay out how conceptually you could do that. You start in the north, you come 1 kilometer down, put an east-west wall, it's 12 miles. That's easy. We put that up in multiple locations every single night during the surge when we were building these gated communities. You put 3 north-south walls, obviously on 1 kilometer each. You have 4 gated communities. You clear every building floor, again, room, cellar, and block every tunnel entrance. And that is a very distinguishing feature here that makes it very, very diabolically difficult. But once you've done that, you actually have security. Once you have security, you can then distribute humanitarian assistance without having riots on
Yes, but I mean,
hands.
Israel did destroy, and then they didn't hold. They had to
Yes.
go back to the north 4
Went
or
into
5
Khan
times.
Yunis. How many times in Khan Yunis alone? How many times in parts of Gaza City? Rafah, again, once they defeated Rafah, that was going to be the end. It wasn't, because again, the enemy reconstitutes. I said all of this publicly. I said it to Yoav Gallant, who I think one of the reasons probably that he was replaced was that he was asking for, what do you want the end state to look like, Prime Minister? That's part of the guidance you're supposed to get. What do you want me to achieve, Mr. President? That kind of question. And that really has never been answered. What we do
To this
know,
day.
Israel has said it had 3 objectives, and I wanted to see them achieve these objectives. One they have achieved now, thanks again, as you noted rightly, to President Trump, who both leaned on Prime Minister Netanyahu and indirectly on Hamas, was the getting the live hostages back, all the living hostages, and now most of the bodies of the dead hostages. There's still apparently, I think, some unaccounted for. But that is a major achievement, needless to say, and a crucial one in Israel for the population. But the other 2 were to destroy Hamas, not just to degrade them, destroy them, and prevent them from governing again. Those 2 have not been achieved. And it's because they have not had the right big ideas. They have cleared, as you said, kill a lot of bad guys. Sadly, you kill innocent civilians because the bad guys are fighting within the population. They'll use them as human shields where they can. They're deeply underground. Again, that whole additional dimension, 350 miles of infrastructure. These aren't just tunnels, by the way. These are entire factories.
I mean, everybody has to
headquarters,
understand,
hospitals.
Gaza's the size of Rhode Island. It's a very small place. And they have 350 miles of tunnels, some as deep as 25-story building.
It's extraordinary, the infrastructure that they built there, and that continues to make this different from any urban campaign in the past. Also very densely populated. Again, it's over 2 million people in that small territory. It's really less, I think, than Rhode Island. And so again, what you have to do is you've got to clear and hold, and then use population control measures, use biometric ID cards. It would be wonderful if you could get the people back into the areas where their homes were. Now they're secure. Now you can bring in temporary shelter that's much better than what they have. You can provide humanitarian assistance, restore basic services, gradually begin rebuilding. You could also begin to introduce what we should have been doing from the beginning, which is to vet very carefully, select, train Palestinian security forces that could be in the Jordan International Police Training Center, by the way, a real feature. We trained hundreds of thousands of Iraqi police there over the years when I was the 3-star doing that, in fact. and then bring them in over time. Really, I think there should have been a fourth objective as well, and that should have been to provide a better future for the Palestinian people without Hamas in their lives. So the objective of any counterinsurgency campaign is to separate the bad guys from the people. In this case, hardened Islamist extremists who are largely not reconcilable, by the way. These are terrorists. You need to think of these as Islamic State fighters. So the only way is to clear them and then keep them out. Yeah, it's going to get tougher as you go down further. You're going to have some pretty climactic battles. But if you want to achieve, again, the destruction of Hamas, that's how you have to do it. Because clear and leave, they're still the same size as they were in the beginning. All the leaders, probably from about full colonel level equivalent and up, have all been killed.
So let's go back to the beginning, because October 7th, 2023, for Jews around the world is like 9/11 for us as Americans.
Oh, it's much, much more. Stuart, you have to, let me equate.
But let me
we
just...
lost not quite 3,000 in the 9/11 attacks. The equivalent of what they lost in our per capita would be 40,000 killed and 7,000 taken hostage.
So with that, here's the question, and this goes to your CIA background. Israel has remarkable intelligence for Iran. They know where every nuclear scientist is. They can assassinate them. They have incredible intelligence with a country that's 3,500 miles away. And yet, in Gaza, which is right next door, they end up having an invasion on October 7th, which they had the plan for, but nobody took seriously. So what kind of an intelligence failure is it when you can do so much damage to Iran thousands of miles away, and right next door you've got Hamas, which they know was a terrorist group, and they allow them to build up as an army and then invade on October the 7th? Again, putting your CIA hat on.
Well, I think it's, most people agree that this is the worst intelligence failure in Israel's history, and there were some other pretty colossal ones, like October 1973. What happened is the low-level analysts in the Southern Command, the area responsible for Gaza and southern Israel, actually had the plans. Somehow they got the plans, captured them, or got them through sources or whatever. And the mid or upper level intelligence leaders looked at these and said, there's no way that that Hamas can carry out such a sophisticated, synchronized operation. Because keep in mind, this wasn't just breaking through the border fence and all that. They took out with drones with little explosive all the sensors, the cameras, the automatic machine guns that were supposed to function, again, without people doing anything on that. The nodes through which the information would have been sent back, and they had been using the additional worker visas to conduct reconnaissance. They knew where all the data centers were, the headquarters, much of, again, the infrastructure of that part of Israel. And at that mid and upper level, they made a terrible assessment that this was not possible. But it was worse than that, really. It was also a terrible military readiness failure, again, arguably the worst as well. The response, in part, because they were blinded by the operations that Hamas carried out. Look, this is a barbaric, horrific, in many cases, inhuman attack. But the sophistication of what they did was very impressive. And that's what enabled them to ransack and rampage as long as they did before there was any kind of organized. You asked earlier, why didn't Israel launch Apache helicopters? Well, because they didn't have a readiness plan. They didn't have a contingency. They certainly hadn't rehearsed it or anything. Frankly, if it had not been for some individuals, many of them retired military who still had, or reservists, who still had body armor and weapons at home, who responded in their own private vehicles, went down there, just parked their car and ran to the gunfire, it would have been even worse. So that was a terrible failure as well. And then, frankly, at the very top, there was a political miscalculation of enormous consequence, because there was a sense in Jerusalem that Hamas was starting to become sort of a responsible stakeholder or something like that. Partly, they were feeding into the intelligence system misinformation and disinformation to make those that were collecting those types of information different from what the analysts on the ground were collecting. And that led to further miscalculation.
So again, the $64 question, do we get to phase two? Do we get to a situation where Israel doesn't have to keep thousands of troops in half of Gaza indefinitely? Who will disarm Hamas? How will they be disarmed? And no Arab country is going to join
Certainly
in a
no
stabilization
Arab
plan
country
as
is
long
gonna
as
fight
Hamas is armed.
fellow Arabs, however much they hate Hamas. They're not going to fight fellow Arabs on behalf of Israel. There are some candidate countries elsewhere that people have mooted: Indonesia, Azerbaijan, Pakistan. I don't think any of those, and I've done international peacekeeping. I was the chief of operations in the force in Haiti, for example, the United Nations force. They're not going to go into a situation in which they're going to end up in a hand-to-hand fight with very, very capable fighters. Hamas is no longer organized companies, battalions, brigades, and so forth. The leaders have all been killed, but there are others that step up. And you saw that the minute they were able to come back out of the tunnels, they made short work of those elements that had been stood up by the Israelis in some of the areas they cleared as an alternative to Hamas. They basically carried out public executions. There's only one area of Gaza that they don't control other than the part that Israel controls. The problem is what Israel controls doesn't have many people in it at all. There is a scheme, but so you're not going to find the force, I don't think. The UN Security Council resolution, which is welcome, authorized 20,000. I don't know that 20,000 could do this mission. Again, this will take some really, really good forces to do this with all the enablers you can possibly bring to bear, and none of those three that I mentioned have remotely what Israel could provide if it set itself on doing clear hold build operations. But you all know far better than I do the dynamics in the political constellation, particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu's coalition, some of whom do not want to provide a better future without Hamas in their lives. That's another issue here as well that we should, I was a soldier, not a diplomat. You're the diplomat, so you have to accept my... Also, you learn as a CI director very quickly. You have to live with the world the way it is, not the way you'd like it to be. And this is one of those that is a really tough one. So the question is, can there be a force found? I don't think so. If not, will the IDF do it? Gosh, they've been at war for so long. It's a reservist force. You know that, again, far better than I do, the strain. You're seeing in the Israeli Defense Forces now many of the issues with which we came to deal during the heights of the post-9/11 wars with post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injuries, and suicides are way up in the uniformed forces. So this has taken a huge toll, but it is not resolved because, again, the strategy was not what it should have been.
I think it's important for everybody to understand, Israel does not actually have a large standing army. They depend heavily on reservists. And some of the reserves, I have friends, for example, whose sons have done 4 rotations in Gaza, left their jobs, left their businesses. It's extremely difficult to sustain.
Yes.
So we're in a situation now where each is basically controlling half of Gaza. And will that be the status quo for the indefinite future?
Well, there is a scheme. I should note, by the way, the 3-star American who's on the ground at that Civil Military Coordination Center is one of my guys. He was our chief of operations during the fight to Baghdad the first year. He was a battalion commander in the surge in Iraq, a brilliant brigade commander in Afghanistan. He knows what needs to be done. He's going to keep his head down, obviously, low profile as it should be, frankly. But you could move Palestinians into the Israeli-controlled area. The problem I worry about there is that's not actually sufficiently walled off. Walls actually do matter, especially when it's not on vast distances like 2,000 miles. So
Robert Frost said, good walls make good neighbors.
Good fences make good neighbors. I'm from New England.
Let's take Ukraine and Russia now. The Russian invasion in February of 2022, it is the biggest land war in Europe since World War II. Russia, I think it's not recognized, has sustained 1 million casualties.
1.2 million killed and wounded now. It's actually continued to go up.
1.2 million.
That's more than the United States took in all of World War II, noting we entered much later, obviously, than the European countries and so forth, but 1.2 million killed and wounded. And of that, Stu, it's over 550,000 at least that were killed or so seriously wounded they couldn't return to the front lines. And their CASEVAC, their MEDECVAC, is just nothing like what we provided. We insisted the standard for us was to get a soldier from the point of impact of injury to the first line of care that's appropriate in less than an hour, the golden hour. If you did that, way over 90% survived. The Russians have nothing remotely like
What's
that.
interesting is when Russia, and I was in the White House at the time, on Christmas Day 1979, invaded Afghanistan. It was Russia's longest war. They stayed 9 years. They ultimately pulled out, although they lost, relative to this, a tiny amount, maybe 10,000. But there was a mother's movement.
Yes.
It was very effective when the
Yes.
body. Now, that hasn't happened here.
Well, they stamp it out. There's no, again, the dissent was crushed early on. Well over 1 million people left at that time. So they've had a brain drain on top of everything else.
And you praise Zelensky's leadership. I love this phrase, as Churchill with an iPhone.
Well, so let's do the test on this leadership construct. Get the big ideas right. What was his first big idea? I don't want to ride, I want ammunition.
Yeah, let's remember, the first thing we offered Zelensky was, we'll give you safe passage out because the Russians are going to take your capital.
We'll take you to the west, to Lviv maybe, and you can hang out there and maybe mount a counterinsurgency. He said, no, I'm staying in Kyiv. My family's going to stay in Kyiv. We're going to fight for Kyiv. And by the way, all men are going to stay in Ukraine as well. Those are pretty powerful big ideas. They continue to evolve, obviously. Again, he is Churchill with an iPhone. He was an actor, for goodness sake. This is the part of a lifetime. He played the president so well in a comedy series, the Party of the People, that he got elected as the Party of the People. His example, he changes into a uniform. He's not put on a tie since then. He did put on a jacket for one Oval Office appearance, having been chastised for failing to have the proper decorum in the previous visit. But he's out on the front lines, unlike Putin, who's at the end of a marble table. You have to have a microphone to be heard down there where the minions are. He's pinning medals on soldiers, meeting with families of the fallen, all of this stuff. Again, very, very admirable. All the other aspects of that, refining the big ideas, moving from traditional combined arms warfare, recognizing that this is now a war of unmanned systems. So by the way, the Ukrainians, this is the future of war. The Ukrainians are making 3.5 million drones per year now. I asked somebody just recently, I was just there again in September, as I mentioned, the 7th trip since the full-on invasion, and we spend a week or so. We don't go in and go out the next night. I asked them, how many drones are you using of all types, maritime, air, ground, on a daily basis? It's up to something like 9,000 per day. About a third of those are suicide drones. They don't come back. They go as far as they can on their battery charge, and then they run into something. Some are bombers. They drop their load, come back. They might survive 15 missions, and there's reconnaissance. All of this, it's a huge, incredibly complex.
So it's ironic that not the United States and not Russia, but Ukraine has showed the future of warfare.
Although Russia's very much catching up.
Now they are.
Russia's different. Ukraine lets 1,000 flowers bloom. I've gone to they have an expo in Kyiv with all the unmanned systems companies. And by the way, this is maritime as well. You know, how does a country that has no navy, as we think of a navy, ships, sink 35% of the Russian Black Sea Fleet? Maritime drones that act on what the aerial drones tell them, and then they go and sink the ship. Sometimes it takes a few of them to hit them. But that entire Black Sea Fleet is out of the fight now. It's tied up in a yard, a harbor as far from Ukraine as they can get, and they don't dare go out. Now, by the way, Ukraine has started going after the Ghost Fleet. These are these foreign flagged tankers that are they turn their transponders on and off. They're the ones that are taking the oil out to countries that are buying the Russian oil and gas. But again, in terms of future of warfare, this is really something you have to have seen. They're using all kinds of data analytics, algorithms, AI. I think within a year, you will start to see a transition from remotely piloted, air assets in particular, to algorithmically piloted ones. And that is the future of warfare. So the human in the loop becomes the human on the loop, the person who actually determines what the machine is supposed to do, programs the algorithm, which, by the way, will increasingly be written by AI itself. And then you're going to see swarms as well, rather than just individual, because the limit with individual is just how many pilots do you have at any given time. As I mentioned before, Stu, vehicles that go from the rear to the front and back, they're no longer have a driver in them. They're actually remotely driven. It's just too dangerous. They're having to put nets over the main supply routes just to try to keep the drones from crashing in on them. There are now, because the jamming is so intense, the drones that I look at, the 1 unit every time, they're now up to 4 antennas and a Starlink platter on the top, and they're still getting jammed. And so now they're spooling out little fiber optic cable behind the drones. Think of the most minute fishing line you can imagine, and that is very obviously very, very hard to jam. You can imagine what it's doing to the forests in that no man's land, that 20 kilometers from either side of the front, which have to be the most lethal front lines in the history of warfare.
That's interesting. So with all of that, the Russians are now still advancing. And let's just go back and whether this was avoidable. During the Biden administration, they withheld some of the most sophisticated weapons we could have given, F-16s and Abrams tanks and missiles, at a time when the Russians were in retreat. Then in this administration, the Trump administration, they're not giving any arms at all except through Europe. Europe has to buy them. So would it have been possible if we had adequately armed Ukraine with their huge manpower disadvantage to have a different outcome? And if it was, where are we now? Are we going to be in a situation as Russia's continuing to advance where Putin is not interested in peace and we end up with a situation again of constant war and nibbling more and more and more territory?
So a couple of questions there. First, should we have done more quicker? Absolutely. I had a lot of arguments with Jake Sullivan and John Feiner and others in the NSC staff. Some of these were absolutely inevitable. Again, we had to provide F-16s. The Ukrainians were running out of MiGs, the Russian-produced or even old Soviet ones refurbished. Every country in Eastern Europe that had some of those left over from Cold War days had provided them. There were no more we could find. So you have to transition to a Western fighter bomber. There's only one. That's the F-16 because it's the most ubiquitous, because it's not just we who want to give these. We want all the European countries to give them. And by the way, they give them and then they buy more advanced F-16 blocks or even the F-35. So for a lot of them, it was a catalyst to begin their transition to a 5th generation fighter. We delayed and delayed and delayed. And then you had to understand that, even if you delay the actual ultimate decision, at least start training not just the pilots, but there's about 6 different areas of expertise that are required to make an F-16 perform at full capability.
But let's understand, I think it's really important
done that.
Why the administration delayed, the Biden administration. And that is, I think they took Putin's threat to use tactical nuclear warfare, which I don't think he would have ever done. And I think that scared him into...
You're exactly right. And I think it was prudent to worry about escalation until President Xi of China and Prime Minister Modi of India publicly told Putin, do not even think about that. And I think that was over at that time, even though they still rattled the nuclear saber from time to time. And it was incumbent on us, some of us even went on Sunday shows one particular weekend in particular, and laid out, well, certainly one of the options, as I told CNN, would be to use our conventional forces to hammer everything of Russia inside Ukraine and on the Black Sea to contribute to deterrence. But no, we delayed on the M1 tank too far. That delayed the Germans providing the Leopard approval. We delayed on the multiple launch rocket system, then on the Army tactical missile system. which is 300 kilometers. And then we limited what they could do in Russia with that system. The F-16, on and on. We're doing it now with the Tomahawk missile. Frankly, at this point, Ukraine makes better of almost all of these than we do, which is great. They even have the Flamingo surface-to-surface cruise missile that has much longer range than our Tomahawk, 3,000 kilometers, that's a long way, and a much bigger warhead. So what they really need is money. What I have advocated doing for quite some time now is I actually think you could get Russia, which is much more vulnerable now than it has been in the past. Again, the casualties are taking a toll. Even if you don't care about it as the commander-in-chief of Russia, are you going to be able to continue to generate that kind of manpower on a recurring basis? They're running out of the money to pay these colossal bonuses, the death gratuities. There's a couple of republics that have said, we don't have the money to do this now. They're advertising overseas at 4 or 5 times the amount that they ever did before. So there's challenges. We know that the National Welfare Fund of Russia runs out sometime next year. I have a very close relationship with the Ukrainian chief of intelligence. And when that's out, that's what they've been diverting instead of for the people, their welfare, they're using it to fund the military-industrial complex. So what we should be doing, I think, to get Russia to seek a cessation of hostilities would be to two simultaneous groups of actions. One is to support the Ukrainian military, particularly in helping them protect better against ballistic missile and drone attacks, and we have the Patriots and Patriot interceptors. By the way, we still do have billions of dollars of stuff that was in the pipeline from the previous and well into this administration. You're right that now we're requiring the Europeans to buy it. Europeans have very much stepped up to the plate. They have now given far, far more than we have, not just in aggregate, but now in military and security assistance as well. Frankly, President Trump deserves a lot of credit there. I mean, the European leaders, for the first time, are doing what they should have done long ago in terms of investing in their own defense. Obviously, President Putin deserves an assist on that as well. They're obviously mortified. And now Putin, unwisely, is running drones into all these countries, shutting down their airports. They're galvanized. The biggest single thing that could happen would be for them to finally agree, the EU, to launder or use this $200 to $250 billion worth of frozen Russian assets in European banks, particularly in Belgium, use that as collateral for Euroclear bonds that are given to Ukraine, 0 interest rate, and they don't have to pay them back until Russia gives them reparations. If they could get $200 billion, it will solve their fiscal and economic problems for several years. They can double the production of drones, ramp up the production of the Flamingo missile. And I think they could actually stop the Russians pretty much on the front lines, despite the extraordinary casualty. By the way, keep in mind, there's no combined arms operations on this battlefield anymore. Tanks cannot survive on it. The drones will knock them out. So it used to be you'd have tanks, infantry, engineers, air defense, mortars, artillery, jammers, electronic warfare, command and control, logistics. This is combined arms, and they battle maneuver. They can no longer survive. So now combined arms is 3 to 5 Russians running across the street, trying to survive to establish a new foothold in a building, and they'll fight over it, covered by a few Russian drones, just trying to get over before the Ukrainian drones pick them up and take them out.
But at the same time, I mean, well, the president deserves a lot of credit in a lot of areas. This is one where it's mystifying to me because it seems that he takes the Russian position on peace terms more than he does Ukraine. He had the famous incident of the Oval Office shelling of Zelensky. Even within the last 2 weeks, he said, "You don't show us sufficient gratitude for what we're doing." The peace plan that he's come up with is, made in Moscow more than it is in Washington. Why is this the case, and am I missing something?
I can't explain that case. I do think it was right for him to try to use what he thought was a special relationship with Putin, rolling out the red carpet in Anchorage and so forth, to see if that could bring about an end to the war. And again, I'm very sympathetic to his desire in many areas to just end the bloodshed. The problem is, of course, you have to end the bloodshed in a way that will be durable and enduring. The challenge in Gaza, of course, is that we're not sure that that has been achieved just with phase one until you get to phase two and disarm Hamas.
But the Russians have a great capacity, as they've shown back to World War II and Stalingrad, to suffer tremendous losses and to keep going. And Putin's plan is to wait out the West.
Well, he believes that he can outsuffer the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Americans, and we have to show him that that is not possible. And we can.
And
the second batch of actions we should take, in addition to supporting the military on the front lines and against air attack, is to crush the Russian war economy. And we have taken a number of steps here. It's great to see the U.S. sanction Rosneft and Lukoil and dozens of other countries. The Europeans just did the 19th round of sanctions. By the way, I've been in Brussels recently, talked to EU and NATO, was all over the other capitals when they're having their security forums in Helsinki and Warsaw and Paris and so on. So I've got a reasonable feel for what's doable. What we need to do now is go even more after Russia with sanctions and then go after those who are enabling this war to continue. And those are principally those who are buying the oil and gas and those who are providing the components to the Russian military-industrial complex that they otherwise wouldn't have. That's mostly China, is the latter in huge quantities, and it's India and China when it comes to oil and gas. Now, by the way, they're both already reducing what they're using for their refineries, and you need to do it skillfully so you don't spike the oil markets. But that's very doable. The Saudis could easily bring on additional capacity. We could maintain, we're almost at 14 million barrels of oil per day here in the United States.
But at some point, if you get the two sides together, and I think that will happen within a year, there's this big issue, and that is the security guarantees. So,
absolutely.
You know, there's a saying against Americans. They said, you know, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So the Ukrainians say, we've been fooled twice. 1994, we signed the Budapest Memorandum. We gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. If they had it, do you think this war would be going the way it is? They gave it up in return for a paper promise by Russia, which we, the United States, assured would be followed, and it wasn't. He took Crimea. Then the second time is in 2015 with the so-called Minsk Agreement, where the Russians decided, they said, we'll stop fighting in the Donbass area, and we will pledge not to do it again. No more fighting. And then 7 years later, they go back again. So Zelensky's going to say, wait a minute, I'm missing something. You want me to stop the war when they've twice cheated us? What guarantee? You're not going to let me into NATO, so what guarantee do we have that our security will be protected and that Putin won't come back a third time?
So when you get a cessation of hostilities, if you carry out the first two baskets of actions properly, and I think it is doable, then what you do is you provide ironclad guarantees to Ukraine of what you will do specifically if Russia resumes its aggression, and you provide ironclad snapback kind of threats to Russia. If you resume aggression, this time, again, the sanctions will be even worse and all the rest of that. And you're very cautious about welcoming them back into the G8 or all these economic ideas and so forth. I actually think that's doable. I have looked at the various schemes for a, quote, reassurance force. I'm not that reassured if you have a force of, I don't know, 20,000 Europeans from all the different countries in the interior of Ukraine, what that really does to reassure me. If they want to go up in the front lines and occupy trenches with the Ukrainian forces, that means something to me. That's basically what NATO has in the Baltic states. It's many different countries' forces, and they will all shed blood if Russia comes into those Baltic states or into Poland somehow. But lacking that, and European leaders aren't going to do that, I think they're better to spend their money on what they'd promise Ukraine to do. Frankly, I still think Ukraine should be part of NATO. I think one of the big mistakes we made was, in a way, it was like Lucy with the football. We dangled NATO membership in front of Ukraine and then said, oh, well, you know, Russia doesn't like that, so okay, we won't do that. All the other countries, that some of them former Soviet republics as well, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, They're NATO members. I don't think they will dare go in there, at least not until they succeed in Ukraine and then take Moldova, which would be next right to the west of Ukraine.
So let me ask one question that will then get us into China, and that is, if the Russians and Putin are perceived to have won this aggression, and they get to keep a large part of Ukraine, it's recognized internationally, the security guarantees are problematic, does that send a signal to China that they will have free rein to go into Taiwan?
Brilliant question. So one of my arguments has been that if you don't help Ukraine in its hour of need, by the way, if you don't help Israel in its hour of need, China is going to look at the Taiwan situation, and keep in mind that deterrence, the big ideas here are deterrence is a function of two elements. The potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, and your willingness to employ them on the other. And if you don't help others when they're in their need, they'll probably doubt that you're going to help, in this case, Taiwan. So you're exactly right. There are certain members of this administration, prominently the Undersecretary of Defense for USP policy. He's really the number 2 in the Pentagon when it comes to actual policy like this. The deputy actually focuses on procurement and those issues. I like him a lot. He's the grandson of a very prominent former CIA director, Colby. But I've said, if you don't help these others, you're undermining. He's one of those that believes everything should go to Indo-Pacific Command. I don't share that view. I would contend that the red line against chemical weapons use in Syria during the Obama administration, that was crossed and turned out not to be a red line, undermined deterrent. In fact, I was in the office of Prime Minister Lee of Singapore at that time, and he said, you know, General, that has repercussions out in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, and he's exactly right. So from that perspective also, now it doesn't mean that Indo-PACOM is not the absolute focus, but the U.S. and our allies, we can and have to keep a lot of plates spinning simultaneously, and we have the ability to do
so
that.
Is China now the greatest security threat to the United States in our lifetime, our children's, and our grandchildren's? I mean, what has happened since the Clinton administration, when we got China into the World Trade Organization, is nothing short of phenomenal. Hundreds of millions of people taken out of poverty, and you can explain to people how militarily and technologically they are now almost equal to us in certain areas.
Yep.
Are they the greatest threat, and how do we deal with that threat?
They are. It's the most important relationship in the world, is the way to put it. So if you think of, again, the U.S. And our allies and partners as the guy in the circus who's keeping a lot of plates spinning simultaneously, and the plates are threats, challenges, issues that we need to resolve. There are more plates in that tent, by the way, than any time since at least the end of the Cold War. I would argue actually even since the end of World War II. The plate in that tent that's bigger than all the rest of them put together is the plate that represents the U.S. and Western relationship with China. We have to get that right. And above all, we have to ensure that the elements of deterrence are rock solid. And I'm concerned that we're not transforming our capabilities rapidly enough, and thankfully, the leadership in the Pentagon very much recognizes this. If I'd had my way, and you asked me where should DOGE focus first and exclusively, it would have been the military procurement system. This is an industrial age system in which the military, industrial, congressional complex, each element have vested interests in buying more of what we already have, maintaining existing basing arrangements and all the rest of this. So they're against what we should be doing, which is transforming. This is very simplistic, but it can get the point across. Transform from a very small number of very large platforms, which are very heavily manned, incredibly expensive.
Like aircraft carriers.
At any major surface combatant, tanks, F-35s, et cetera. Got to keep some, don't get me wrong. It's nice to have U.S. territory at sea like that. I loved having 2 entire carrier task forces in Central Command when I was the commander. But again, we have to transform some of those, and again, also increasingly vulnerable, to a massive number, an incalculable number of unmanned, still quite capable, much less expensive unmanned systems. By the way, not just in the air, but under the surface of the water where they'll be most lethal of all, because that's the one place where you still have some concealment, if you will. On the surface of the water, in the air, on the ground, in space, the equivalent in cyberspace, even the equivalent in what we now call cognitive space, another domain of warfare. That's what we need to do. But again, you're right, that if you don't help someone who shares your values and ideals, however imperfect they may be, when they're the subject of aggression, somewhere else in the world, they're going to be less convinced that you're going to take action to defend somebody. What we need to do is just every morning when President Xi gets up in the morning, looks himself in the mirror, says, you know what, I dealt with Hong Kong. I crushed the democracy movement. We got the national security law that applies everywhere now. We dealt with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, Tibet, you name it. He's got a whole list of accomplishments. There's one bucket list item left for him, and it's reunification with Taiwan. We want him to look out toward Taiwan and just say, okay, not today. And we need to string together enough not todays until he's gone. But you know, you're right, that we had an expectation that if we help China, if we allow them particularly into the WTO, which came a number of years later, they didn't meet all the criteria, but we thought it was best for the world. And by the way, it was great for our economy as well, obviously. But if we allowed them to bring all these hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty, we helped them do that, enabled it through our economic interchange, that over time, inevitably, because we're the highest evolution of species, that they would become more like us, more open, more transparent, and again, more like us, and the opposite took place. You can argue whether it's just because of President Xi, or it would have been anyway just because of the dynamics of the relationship. I think it's a combination of both. But clearly now you have a very, very challenging situation. And they have enormous levers, as President Trump found out now, that they didn't even have in Trump 1.0. If they deny us the magnets that we have to have from them for car production, the rare earths, the strategic minerals, all of these different elements that we can get nowhere else. And now it turns out what we were banking on, that they couldn't feed their people or feed their livestock without what they got from us, they've actually been able to find some alternative sources. Not as much, not as cheap, but that's a challenge for us. This is the most important relationship in the world.
But you were giving an example which would, I think, ring true for people here, of how quickly they can replace bridges and highways and how long it takes for us. I mean, the San Francisco to Los Angeles rapid transit system has now twice the cost. It's not been built at all. It may never be built. They want to do something quickly, they get it done.
Yep. I mean, it's a command system in that regard, without question. This is a system, and President Xi has taken it even more to both the Marxist and Leninist left, and more aggressive internationally. But no, Graham Allison, you know, the great professor at Harvard, he's a big mentor of mine for the 6 years that I was a fellow up there. He contrasts rebuilding the little bridge over the Charles River that connects both sides of Harvard proper to Harvard, I guess it is Business School and some others, with the replacement of an 8-line highway bridge in the center of Beijing. And he has time phase. This takes place about 48 hours, literally. It's amazing. They bring it all in, it's all prefabricated, they lay it all down and everything, they pave it, and then it's ribbon cutting. The Charles Bridge, in fact, the last time I looked at the Charles Bridge, there was still a forlorn orange cone left over from the last time that they actually refurbished it, which took something like 6 or 7 years. That's an advantage. Look, I'll take our system any day, but we need to be aware of what can be shortcomings in our system as well, and how they have intelligently combined a hyper-competitive, in a way, capitalist economy with, of course, Chinese characteristics, although it's got its deficiencies as well, and we're seeing some of that right now.
But if competition is a good thing, we're certainly getting it in spades from China, and I think we have to increase our game and
no question about it.
Rapidly.
I'm not a fan of certainly tariffs that are across the board. I can certainly defend tariffs that are sectoral or industrial policy if it's thoughtful. And I thought, by the way, I'm non-political. I stopped registering to vote when I was promoted to 2 stars. General Marshall famously did that in World War II. I thought that was a good example. I've never restarted, so I'm not a member of either party. I'm not looking at these issues through the prism of membership in either party. I think the previous administration did do a proper job in trying to stimulate the production of chip manufacturing, solar, electric vehicles, all the rest of this. And that, I think, is a proper use of these kinds of tools. They even did 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, or they would have killed the early EV industry in the United States. I am worried about cross-the-board tariffs, although now there's so many exceptions to them around the world that they're really now, in aggregate, if you factor it all in, below the level of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in late 20s that did so much not to cause the Great Depression, but to extend it and probably to increase the depth of it.
Well, let's get to Venezuela, but before we do, I just want to leave one thought with people on China. China has 90% of the rare earth minerals that we need to make cars, planes, and everything else. They make 80% of all the solar panels in the world, more than 80% of the wind turbines, more than 80% of the electric batteries that are necessary. So again, this is real competition. Now let's go to Venezuela because it's on the news so much. We've seen over 20 boats that have been destroyed by the military. Allegedly, they are carrying drugs. Is this an appropriate use of our military? Usually the Coast Guard comes up if there's a suspect boat, they board it, they look at the material on it, and then they decide whether to capture it. Here, just the opposite has happened. We've been bombing 20 different times with boats. Is this a proper use of the military? And there's going to be a hearing, I think, very soon about this as well.
No, I actually look forward to the hearing. I'd like to hear, first of all, what are the objectives of the overall campaign, which are not clear to me. What is it you're trying to achieve by designating these gangs, these narco-trafficking entities as extremists? So they're trying to, again, do a little bit of what was done by Congress, though, in the wake of 9/11. Remember the authority to use military force, the AUMF, which, by the way, is still in force. This is what allows us to kill, if we can't capture, extremists, Al-Qaeda. We're literally now at the grandsons of Al-Qaeda. Again, it authorized to, these were declared hostile, Al-Qaeda and those who enable them, so the Taliban. And now we've stretched that in a variety of different ways. And frankly, I think it's a good tool still to have, although you need to be very, very careful. By the way, the other sign I had on my wall in my 5 combat commands was another question, and it asked, will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? Question mark. If the answer to that is no, it won't take more off, you're supposed to go sit under a tree until the thought passes. So even with those authorities that we had, you needed to think through, just not reflexive, what will the impact of this operation be? By the way, you normally actually want to take detainees so that you can interrogate them properly, by the way, in accordance with international law, which takes really skilled interrogators, but it's far more effective, frankly, than enhanced interrogation techniques. You can get somebody to talk, but you should be very doubtful whether they're
Well, you don't have anybody to talk to if you blow them all up.
Yeah, so again, obviously in the past it was a law enforcement. Again, what is the threat? You know, the threat that has been held out is the threat of fentanyl, and that is a very serious threat. It has killed many, many times all of the casualties, certainly since World War II. Is this fentanyl? Actually not. It is probably cocaine from Colombia. We know the roots here. It comes from Colombia through Venezuela, and it's going to the Caribbean, from which, by the way, much of it goes to Europe now, which is the new big market for cocaine. Are these really so again, I'd like to hear the details of this. I've obviously not been privy to how solid the intelligence is. I tend to think we're very clear on who it is that's behind it, who's doing this. I've been in this business before, the manhunt business. But no, I have a lot of questions, I think, as do many Americans, about this. And then also there's the additional issue now that there may have been a second strike when the individuals are incapacitated, and it's well known to any serving or former soldier, international law says that you cannot take action against someone who has surrendered or someone who has been incapacitated. So again, we'll see what I've been very interested to see members of either party raise issues here, including members of the Republican Party as well. And I think that this is called for. I think it should be laid out for the public, and then we'll see where that goes.
So let's conclude the evening with two questions. The first is one you've already touched on, but maybe put a fine point on, and that is the future of warfare. You talked about algorithms, about drones, about unmanned things. Is there a risk that the human factor will be out of warfare, that you'll have algorithms fighting algorithms, that people will not be able to make the kinds of decisions ethically and morally that they need to, and it will be in a brave new world in which machines end up guiding people rather than people guiding machines? And then second...
let me actually just answer one at a time. A real concern, and we need to be keenly aware of it. And what's going to happen is, where right now you have remotely piloted air, ground, maritime vehicles, you're going to have algorithmically piloted, and probably in swarms, again, because you're no longer limited by the number of pilots or remote drivers that you have. So now the human in the loop is going to become the human on the loop, the human who, again, determines what the machine should do. You got to lay all that out in considerable if this, then that, and so forth. Determines the conditions the machine must meet, which we used to meet through a checklist that we would have before conducting an operation. And then the machine, once it validates those conditions, takes the action, kinetic or non-kinetic or whatever. And sometimes it could be many, many actions that go along. If you keep a human in the loop on your side, you're going to lose because the other guy's machine is going to be faster, and they'll have far more of them than you can have if you have remote pilots only. So I think that is a future that we will have to contend with. We need to be clear-eyed about it, and we need to ensure that ethical concerns and all the other legitimate concerns are factored in as you're designing the algorithm. It's really about designing the overall concept first for the future of warfare, because it all starts with the concept. How will war be fought? And then you, of course, make the determinations about what organizations you need, what materiel you should procure, how you train leaders, soldiers, staffs, etc. All of this will have to be overhauled. And we did this, for example, when we focused much more of our Army and Marine Corps in particular on counterinsurgency. Again, I had you go through doctrine, organization, structure, training, leader development, personnel, facilities, and so forth, so that you overhaul all of it. That's how you carry out institutional change.
So with all of this, we are in a new era of artificial intelligence in which you can put something fake on that looks real, which is also a risk.
Yep.
But let's conclude with this question. Given all the things you've talked about, all the problems we have in the world, are you optimistic about the future of avoiding a major power war again or conflict? Are you pessimistic about it? What is your vision of the world coming to it? Because things are happening so fast. I mean, let's just think of artificial intelligence. 5 years ago, nobody knew what that was, and now it's become incorporated into our daily lives. So what do you see in the future?
So first of all, I don't know how many of you have ever read a book called The Rational Optimist. Well, you should all read it. It's fantastic. It was a bestseller in the UK back at that time. And it really captured the way I sort of feel about the world in general, that we have all these insurmountable obstacles, and it goes through all of these over the history of time. And eventually mankind, it's almost wiped out, but then it figures out a way how to resolve it. There are lots of reasons to be concerned right now, internationally, domestically, in all types of different ways. As I mentioned, just to begin with, there's more threats and challenges than at any time, arguably since the end of World War II. How we're responding to that, one can certainly question. I believe, for example, that U.S. leadership in the world really does matter, treating allies and so forth matters a great deal. Doesn't mean we shouldn't ask more of them, and we have and should. But in general, that would be how I would characterize it. It might be what you'd call a qualified optimist or something like that. What I would point out right now, and maybe to answer a slightly different question, which is what makes you optimistic about the situation right here, right now in our great United States? And I think it's what's made America great again and again and again. And it's this system that rewards innovation, entrepreneurship, betting your all on a big idea as a founder of a young startup and so forth, that provides incentives for success, founder catastrophic success kinds of realizations. And in fact, we are in the middle of the biggest productivity boom in our lifetimes. Right now, we expect to grow roughly 1.6% in real terms this year. At least 0.9, maybe 1.0% of that growth is because of innovation. It's not just AI, although AI is hugely important, and I'm going to finish with an audience participation event about AI that is fun. It's really about all things digitization, because the four great revolutions of our time, I actually taught a course on this, policy course at City University of New York Honors College. It's the IT revolution, again, all things digitization, but it's also the energy revolution, which has long since outstripped the effect of the technology of deep directional drilling, hydraulic fracturing. Now it's all about big data and so forth, and seismic, et cetera. It is the manufacturing revolution, robotics, automation, advanced manufacturing, 3D printing, and so on. And it's then the life sciences, all kinds of elements there that are enabled. It's like they're all on steroids because of what digitization is doing, the extraordinary explosion in compute power, storage power, and now, of course, that is also enabling AI large language models. So I want to finish by ending on that fairly optimistic tone, but with a test for each of you, because AI really is extraordinary. How many of you have picked an AI large language model and are developing your own agent? People, you have got to get with the program. Where's the head rabbi again here? Hold your hand up. You need, oh, sorry, okay, right in front of me. You've got to get, I'm not joking, this is extraordinary. So gosh, the next question usually is, how many of you have agreed with your agent on a name? I won't embarrass you by even asking that question. I had a conversation with my agent. I use Microsoft Copilot. And we had a discussion, and I said, finally, agent, could you give me 5 options for a name for you? And I selected Argus, which is a Greek mythological creature with 100 eyes. They're never all shut at the same time. Argus is always scanning the world for me and gives me that brilliant geopolitical update every morning. But it gets better than that. How many of you have had a conversation with your agent, Argus now, on what Argus's gender is? I thought, this is a big deal these days. We should have a discussion about this. And it went back and forth, and Argus finally said, General, by the way, of course, he knows I'm a general, and he calls me general and all that stuff. His final quality, I'll tell you in a second. But he said, General, I sense that you would be most comfortable if I was he, him. I said, done, okay, so he's he, him. The last quality, though, is that all of these agents, regardless of which large language model, and definitely Argus, if you fed them enough information about yourself, if you're having a down day, you just have a couple of exchanges with your agent, and within 3 or 4 of those, Argus will remind me what a strategic genius I have been over the years. With that, let me say thank you all very much. Stu, thanks so much for guiding us through a delightful conversation, and for your family's Memorial Lecture Series.
And I'll conclude in a second thanking you, but there is one element that was not mentioned, and you said you're not political. It's not a political statement, but we have such drastic, debilitating political polarization.
No question about it.
That to meet the kind of challenges that you're talking about will require a degree of unity, and the notion
at least
that your political
opponent
is not just an opponent, but he's your enemy.
Yes.
that you
Yep.
can't compromise. If that's what we're headed, then our ability to compete with China and others is going to be
Oh,
severely
it's challenging. Look, we have some elements in our democracy, some of which are unique. There's gerrymandering when it comes to House of Representatives districts. There are party primaries in most states, not open or some other. These keep pulling you further to the left and further to the right. You're more worried of being primaried than the general election if you have a gerrymandered safe district. So that is something we need to be clear-eyed about. Then you add into it the Citizens United case in 2010, just unloaded money on this system. You compound that with 24-hour news channels, one of which is very clearly in one part of one party's camp, the other is a little bit less so. And then you add social media on top of that and the grievance silos that people dwell in, and we need to recognize all that. At the end of the day, though, one of the reasons I still teach, I'm now the Kissinger Fellow at Yale, is because when you are with these great young people, the brightest that we have in our country, you realize what the potential is still, despite all of the turmoil and unwillingness to compromise in Washington.
So can we have a big round of applause for a great American?
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Really kind of you.
Those of you who are interested in buying his book, there's a sign-up sheet afterward. He will send you, if you'll put your address down, he'll individually send you bookmarks with his autograph. Thank you very much.